Picture it, a line wrapping around a museum block. People standing in the rain for hours. Timed tickets, security barriers. A tote bag that costs $48. And somewhere inside that building, behind climate-controlled systems, insurance contracts, corporate sponsorships, and at least 3 people saying the phrase immersive experience, is a painting. Maybe a very famous painting. Maybe 20 paintings. Maybe a dead artist suddenly being marketed like the hottest concert tour of the year. And the museum says, hurry, limited engagement. Because somewhere along the line, museums stopped simply displaying art and learned how to sell anticipation. Welcome to Art Happens, the divine mess of art history, presented by J² Atelier. I'm James William Moore, and today we're talking about the birth of the museum Blockbuster, the moment museums discovered that exhibitions could become spectacles, that attendance could become cultural currency, and that if you put enough masterpieces in one room, people would line up like it was opening weekend for a superhero movie. This is the story of museums, media frenzy, velvet ropes, impossible crowds, and how art history became an event experience. And honestly, it changes the way we look at museums to this day. For most of museum history, going to the museum was not exactly a mass cultural event. Museums in the 19th and early 20th centuries often projected seriousness, quiet halls, soft footsteps, a sense that you were entering a temple of culture. The audience museums imagined was usually educated, upper class, and already comfortable with art history. You did not go for entertainment. You went for improvement. And museums absolutely loved that image. They wanted authority, stability, prestige. The museum wasn't supposed to feel like excitement. It was supposed to feel like civilization. But by the mid-20th century, that model started cracking. Television existed, movies existed, mass tourism exploded, and museums suddenly found themselves competing with literally everything else people could do on a Saturday afternoon. Institutions faced a terrifying question. How do you get ordinary people excited about art? And the answer became, you make the exhibition feel historic, rare, temporary, exclusive. You make people afraid to miss it. And then came the king, literally. No, not Elvis. But in the 1970s, the traveling exhibition, Treasures of Tutankhamun, exploded across the United States and Europe. Ancient Egyptian gold, the death mask, jewelry, objects buried for thousands of years, and audiences lost their minds. The exhibition drew millions of visitors. People waited hours. Cities treated it like a major cultural event. Souvenirs flooded stores. Media coverage became relentless. The museum exhibition had suddenly become a phenomenon, and museums noticed something very important. Crowds create more crowds. If people see lines, they assume the thing at the end of the line matters. Attendance itself becomes proof of importance. And suddenly, museums began chasing scale, bigger loans, bigger names, bigger marketing campaigns. Because blockbuster exhibitions didn't just bring prestige, they brought money. Restaurants filled up, gift shops exploded, memberships increased. Sponsorships got visibility. Museum boards got very excited because the Blockbuster turned culture into economic power. By the 1980s and 1990s, the formula was fully alive. You take an artist with instant name recognition, Vincent van Gogh, Pablo Picasso, Claude Monet. You gather works from collections around the world. You frame the exhibition as once in a lifetime. And then you market it like crazy. Posters, television spots, magazine covers, merchandise, special member nights, catalogs heavy enough to injure someone. And museums learned another lesson. People love proximity to fame, even art fame. There's something deeply emotional about standing in front of a painting you've seen reproduced your entire life. You suddenly encounter scale, texture, brushstrokes, the physical object itself. And museums lean into that feeling hard. The Blockbuster promised an encounter with greatness, not just art appreciation, but participation in a cultural moment. And honestly, some of these exhibitions were extraordinary. Scholars collaborated internationally. Works rarely seen together suddenly shared walls. New research emerged. Entire generations encountered art in transformative ways. But there was also a cost. Because once attendance numbers become important, museums start programming differently. Safer exhibitions, recognizable names. Art is brand identity. And smaller artists, riskier histories, experimental work, those often became harder sells. And then things escalated. Because eventually the Blockbuster wasn't enough. Museums started entering the experience economy. Not just exhibitions, experiences. Instagrammable rooms, immersive projections, cocktail nights, after-dark events, interactive installations. And suddenly, the museum wasn't competing with other museums anymore. It was competing with entertainment culture itself, which raises a very uncomfortable question. What happens when museums start measuring success primarily through attendance? Because popularity and importance are not always the same thing. Sometimes difficult art is quiet. Sometimes challenging work does not produce giant crowds. Sometimes the most historically important exhibition in a decade attracts fewer visitors than a room full of digital sunflowers projected on walls. And museums today live inside that tension constantly. Education versus spectacle, scholarship versus marketing, public access versus donor expectations, art versus content. And to be fair, there is no simple answer here, because Blockbuster exhibitions also democratized museum culture. They brought in audiences who may never have entered a museum otherwise. They made art feel accessible, exciting, shared. For many people, their first meaningful museum experience happened because of a Blockbuster show. That matters a lot. But perhaps nothing captures the Blockbuster era better than the museum gift shop, because the Blockbuster doesn't end when you leave the gallery. It follows you home on mugs, scarves, magnets, pencils, tote bags, tiny plastic replicas of ancient artifacts. You walk through an exhibition about mortality and human civilization and exit through snow globes. And honestly, I kind of love that contradiction, because museums have always balanced multiple identities. They are educational institutions, archives, tourist destinations, status symbols, community spaces, and increasingly, they are brands. Some museums now market exhibitions years in advance, like movie studios announcing release dates. And the public responds the same way. People travel internationally for exhibitions. They post on social media art selfies, collect catalogs like trophies. The exhibition itself becomes social currency. I was there! Not unlike concerts, or film premieres, or major sporting events. The museum Blockbuster taught institutions something enormous. Art could become mass culture without losing cultural legitimacy. That is a very powerful combination. The museum Blockbuster changed art history forever. It transformed museums from quiet vaults of authority into engines of cultural spectacle. Sometimes that transformation expanded access. Sometimes it flattened complexity. Sometimes it produced extraordinary scholarship. Sometimes it produced a gift shop selling impressionist oven mitts. Usually, a little bit of all of the above. But maybe the strangest thing about the Blockbuster Museum experience is that it reveals something very human. People want collective encounters with meaning. They want to stand in rooms together and feel close to history, beauty, fame, mystery, or genius, even if they have to wait in line for 3 hours to do it. And honestly, that line outside the museum may be one of the most revealing artworks of all, because it tells us exactly what a culture believes is worth seeing. This has been Art Happens, the divine mess of art history, presented by J Squared Atelier. I'm James William Moore, and remember, art is messy, museums are messy, and somewhere right now, someone is buying a $12 Van Gogh refrigerator magnet and calling it cultural enrichment. Honestly, good for them. Until next time, keep looking closer.